I want you to take a look at the next section on Elucidate. And these are the spiritual principles. Now, there is much more in writing in here than we'll be going through in class. But it's based, spiritual principles, I wrote a book on Baha'i ethics that is founded on the three legs of Baha'i ethics, essentially, the three legs of the stool. One is virtues, the other is principles, and the third is reciprocity. So, virtue ethics are the ethics we typically practice: love, honesty, kindness, respect, all of those personal qualities. Principles are a little bit different. And the Baha'i International Community, in their publication, Valuing Spirituality in Development, came up with 5 principles. They're unity and diversity, equity and justice, equality of the sexes, trustworthiness and moral leadership, and independent investigation of the truth. And finally, reciprocity. And reciprocity is just the golden rule. Okay? So I want you to take the ideas in your group and talk about the spiritual, the virtues and principles and reciprocity that apply to each of those. And just write it down on that paper. And I'll come around and work with your groups. In other words, if you feel this idea promotes trustworthiness, that's a virtue. Actually, they have trustworthiness and moral leadership down here. Say if that promotes truthfulness or kindness or compassion or respect or whatever virtue it promotes, and then talk about the principle that might be part of that. And finally, reciprocity. And let me give you an example of using a spiritual principle, a difficult solution or difficult issue. I was working in India with representatives from a dozen different villages. And I was saying to them, I said, what is the greatest issue in your community? What is the most controversial issue? And they say, burning the fields. Because India is just filled with smoke, and every year they burn every field. And when they do that, when they burn the field, it creates a number of difficult problems. It drives out wildlife, it creates a lot of air pollution, things like that. I said, well, which of these spiritual principles do you think are important in helping us resolve that issue? And it was a surprise to me. They looked at that and they said, well, equality of the sexes, because we never talked to the women in our community. So they realized that they needed to consult with everyone in the community. And it was very interesting insight. I wasn't expecting them to do that, to say that. Okay? But spiritual principle. So I want you, with each idea you have, and you can do this individually and then talk about it as a group with the different ideas, because at this point, all of you should have read every idea, or if you haven't, go through and review them to make sure that you have. I want you to talk about what is, and I'm just going to make it very simple on you. What is one virtue you feel needs to go with this idea? What is one of these principles? And reciprocity is the golden rule. So does this particular idea allow for a form of reciprocity? Okay? Does it allow people to exchange in some way? So take a look at and write it right on the pieces of yellow paper. What are the spiritual aspects involved? And what I want you to do as a group is kind of write, well, what virtue do you feel goes with this? Okay. What principle do you feel is important with this? And does it have a reciprocal aspect to it? In other words, is it done, with others in some form of social exchange?
So you write that on the paper?
Yeah, write that right on the paper. Very simple, though. One virtue, one principle, and you can read to the group. Actually, let me take a step back. Read the idea to the whole group, and everyone talk about what virtue you think should be applied there, what principle should be applied, and the aspects of reciprocity that it offers. Okay? Let me give you one example of how I use this with a business. Okay, and then I think we're going to look at this in a little more complete way too. I was working with a business, a pharmaceutical company, and they had a particular issue. And we actually, in this case, we reframed the issue from a larger perspective, and that generated 6 different choices. I mean, it's a fairly simple issue. The original issue was the cost of overtime in fulfilling orders out of the warehouse. Okay? So their initial frame was one around dollars and cents. And then I took a look at it and said, well, let's talk about how we define this issue, first of all. So we took a look at it and said, well, is it the dollars and cents? What about the dollars and cents? What are you in business doing? They said, well, we have this product, we want to keep people happy. And the frame really expanded to one of customer satisfaction. So it started out as an issue around how can we optimize, or minimize our expenditures. It went to customer satisfaction. Okay, and so that frame allowed us to generate more choices. If it's dollars and cents, you have relatively few choices. If it's customer satisfaction, we ended up with 6 pretty good choices. Okay, and I said, well, now how do you decide between those 6 choices? And up on the wall, they had their company values. And I said, which of these company values would you use to help resolve this decision? They say, well, the company values of, they had the company value of customer focus. They had a company value of respecting all of our employees. They had, company values like that. So what we did was took the choices that they had based on a bigger frame and compared it to the company values that they had. And when we did that, they came out with one idea stood out as being the idea that addressed the values the company held. Okay? So it really works best, this works best when we have choices available in deciding between which choices to take. And we'll use this in this way a little bit, but I wanted you to reflect on the options you had and see what values were inherent in the particular choices that you had. So with that, they selected that one idea. Now, think about it from an organizational standpoint. Your boss says, well, how did you come to this decision? And you say, well, I looked at all the choices available and the company value statement, and this one is most in alignment with our values. What do you say after that? You say, well, there's nothing you can say. I mean, when you make value-based decisions, they're the most sustainable, they're just long-lasting decisions. There are people that either you can change your value. Well, all you can do if you want to come up with different choices is come up with a different set of values. But value-based decision-making makes your values real because you have to apply them to your actions. Okay? So the intent here ultimately is to apply the values we're identifying to the actions we're taking. Now, as Baha'is, any company can choose the values that it has. Baha'is were fortunate enough to be given the values that mankind should use. So when we use those values, when we use trustworthiness or truthfulness or unity or respect or, courage or fortitude or, forbearance or any of those values, that helps us make a much deeper, much more sustainable, much more meaningful decision. Okay, and so they made the decision based on the company value statement, and what they had when they made that decision, we had strong consensus because people could see this is what we believe, so this is how we need to act. Okay, so the intent when we talk about values is to connect what you believe with what you do, and this is the stage for doing that in dynamic consultation. You get to the point, well, what are the values inherent here? Are these values being expressed? So what I want you to do now is with each of the ideas you have, continue in your investigation, I want to say, of each idea, where you identify what you feel are the virtues that are inherent in that idea, the principles that you feel might be part of that idea, and a reciprocal nature to that idea. And again, reciprocity just means an exchange of some sort. Okay? And as Baha'is, sometimes we come up with an idea that is what I call unilateral, where we just put it out there and nothing has to come back. Well, one aspect of reciprocity is, love, the reciprocal nature of love. The reciprocal nature of all virtues is that they're unilateral. In other words, you offer love unilaterally. You don't require that it be given back. If it is given back, that's how you can build social bonds. But all virtues have to be offered without an expectation of receiving the like back. You have to offer virtues in that way. Reciprocity looks for the way things, do unto others as you have them do unto you, or blessed is he that prefers, his brother over himself, as Baha'is might say. Okay, so looking for a reciprocal nature to your, it's almost contractually, as from a legal perspective, it's almost a mutuality of obligations, if you're used to contract law. It's both parties have duties. Both parties should be in some way part of whatever idea you have. Okay? So in other words, if you want to encourage more seekers, what are the seekers? What is their responsibility? Or what are the friends? What are your friends? And maybe it's just to listen. Okay? But your idea then should include the opportunity for them to listen, the opportunity for some form of reciprocity to take place. Okay, so again, each of the ideas, I want you to look for at least one or the preeminent virtue that you feel this idea might show, the principle that might be involved with this idea, and the reciprocal nature of this idea, what's being exchanged. Okay, because that's what the writings talk about. Now, there are two other principles on an extended list that aren't shown here, and I think those were interesting too. This is the Baha'i International Community Publication. They also identified beauty and service as two additional spiritual principles that might be considered in addition to these 5. So I want you just to reflect on what you have in the way of your ideas, and how would you optimize, how would you improve this idea if you were to bring in whatever spiritual principle you feel should apply. Okay, and I'll come around and talk to you at tables. So we want to end basically this part with a refined idea based on full consultation that includes embedded within it some virtue, some principle, and some reciprocal nature. Okay? So let's talk about that. You can work on the ideas individually and present them to the group, or the group can work together on one idea at a time, whatever you'd like to do. Okay? And I'll come around and talk to you about that.
Oh, I forgot why.
Okay, now, I want to kind of follow through with you where we're at, thinking about it, okay? Because we're going to continue on. When we ask those better questions, we can then create the frame for the issue we're trying to solve. Okay, and the frames, we have a frame here. Let me just give one example. A frame here says, how can those who care about DRBI, Desert Rose Baha'i Institute, work together to realize the potential of DRBI as a successful Baha'i-inspired social and economic development project? Okay, that's the frame that they're giving you. Now, the frame then, because it's at a higher level, allows you to generate more ideas. We generate ideas through meditation, through nature, through sleep, in those quiet times. The point in the video, I just want to go back because that was a very quick video and I will show it again. Well, what he said in the video is that modern brainstorming doesn't work. That what we think of as created, he talks about the book that was written in the 1950s by a man named Alex Osborne, who developed the idea of brainstorming, and the one rule in brainstorming that always comes up is don't criticize. Remember, because he says the ideas are meek and they will disperse and perish if they're criticized. Well, Baha'is fully developed his model in that the first half of what he says, which is what we saw, is Abdu'l-Baha's quote saying it's an axiomatic truth that when we meditate, the Spirit reveals the reality to us. So you have to allow time for that. Baha'is of anybody out there should recognize that's where the new stuff comes from. Okay? Now, he's going to go on and talk about refining ideas, which is the first step of what we're doing here. And he says we refine ideas through vigorous debate, what Baha'is call the clash of differing opinion. You have to have both because it is through that vigorous debate that we really create much better ideas. So I want you to think that as we go through this, I'm going to show you a number of different ways to allow the clash to improve the ideas that we've had. Okay, and you'll see how all of that fits together as we go. So this is kind of the clunky way to do it. We'll go through rough, and then we'll try going through it smoothly and much quicker. Okay, so the big frame, under this big umbrella, we then have many possibilities. I'm not saying the frame leads to more than just one possibility. If your frame only generated one idea, your frame wasn't big enough. Your frame, by definition, is the umbrella over many possibilities. Now, don't worry at this point that the ideas aren't perfect or complete or whatever. Just get them out there, because these are rough ideas, and we're going to refine them in several very simple, easy steps. Steps, again, that we have a couple steps that are nonverbal. Very quickly see which ideas we should go forward with as a group. Okay? So then we have the frame, we have the ideas, the principles, the virtues, principles, and reciprocity. If you take a look at your guide, virtue answers the question, who shall I be? It refers to your inner character. Principle answers the question, what shall I do? It's your outward action. Reciprocity is the relationship between people in a reciprocal type of action, condition, agreement, whatever is going on with people. So we have all three of those, and all I wanted you to do here is reflect on the role of virtues, principles, and reciprocity with the ideas that you had. If you could not find a virtue that might go with this idea, you got the wrong idea. If you could not find a principle to go with it, you've got the wrong idea. Okay? If you found a principle that fully supports it, you probably got a pretty good idea. Or if you found a virtue that is really part of this, you've got a good idea. If you find all three of those, then I think you've got a really good idea. Okay? In that way. Now, remember, too, the importance of choice. And we're going to talk about that as we go through an evaluation. We're going to look at single ideas, but the best, we're going to look at many different choices around a single idea. Because the key to better decisions is having choice. Remember, empathy and options. Okay? So we're going to go through and look at the different choices around ideas. And let me just go around and give you a quick idea what that might mean. Over here we're talking about Baha'i SED projects. Some of the choices they have are around newsletter, a radio, email, hard copy mail, social media. Okay? We're going to take a look at those, and then we're going to refine those in a deeper way. Over here, we're talking about how can we meet the needs of our friends when teaching. Okay? And we talk about core activities, meeting more people, and open your mouth, walk and talk in nature. I mean, we've got different ideas. We're going to kind of see where the group is. Now, the ideas that involve the whole group involve the consensus of the whole group. But there are ideas that individuals can just pursue themselves. But individuals might be interested in the input of the group to make that the best idea possible. Okay? How can we blur the boundary between Baha'is and broader communities? Formally invite members of the broader Baha'i community to well-organized Baha'i-generated events. So there's a number of aspects of that we need to take a look at. What does it mean to formally invite? What is the broader community? And by God, what is a well-organized Baha'i event? There are certain limitations to what we're able to do. Okay, the idea here, we're going to come back. We'll be doing more with these ideas. I just want to get you thinking about them. To encourage the Baha'i youth to meet, engage, and work with youth in other groups. Okay, there are different components there we need to address. We need to take a look at who are these other groups and what type of work would they do. You know, and especially the youth who do this themselves. If you want to work together in service, you want consensus of the broader group. People that feel part of it, and people where we build strong consensus, you will have action. Every group I work with, wherever you have strong consensus, it happens. It just becomes the force of nature among people. If you have weak consensus, it won't happen. And again, weak consensus still means that everyone voted yes. Okay, we'll show how to build the levels of interest. Here, to apply the question of facilitating individual initiative to the unique needs of the community and addressing the reasons you may inhibit. Now, I want to encourage you on ideas. Ideas should start to look like action that we can take. Ideas at this stage don't have to include a budget or a day or a time, but it should have everything other than that, you know, in a kind of an unspecified way. We want to start holding regular meetings. There was over here, they were getting a little too specific, so I had to back off a little bit. Over here is wonderful work here. How can the LSA believers work together to manifest a radiant Baha'i community? That's the frame they're working with. One of their ideas was to dedicate time during every 19-day feast to deepen on compilation for LSA and believers. On the compilation for the LSA?
Yeah, missed a word, huh?
Okay, yeah. Okay.
Oops.
But they want to do this now. In their original idea, I think they said 10 minutes, right? Something like that?
At least.
Okay, well, yeah, but we'll develop the time frame for it very quickly. So we don't need a time frame for it. And if you break it down, we'll talk about, well, do we want to do it every feast or not? That's one question we'll address. We'll talk about who should this be for, what should they be discussing. But they've addressed the virtues they feel, the principles that are appropriate, and the reciprocal aspect of it. Okay? Now, the quote also goes on to say there are certain, the quote says, there are certain spiritual principles, or what some call human values, by which solutions may be found to every social problem. Whenever, I love this quote, whenever two good people argue over principles, they are both right. Okay? So, don't ever argue over principles. If you stop and think about it, in ethics expresses the greatest ethical dilemmas as a conflict of principles. And one of the classical ethical conflicts is truth versus loyalty. Okay? But in the Baha'i faith, we recognize what I believe is no two attributes of God can ever be in conflict with one another. They can't. Absolutely can't. And if they are, you haven't framed it correctly. Okay? If they are... So your classical ethicist, a man, I attended his program on ethics, and he said, well, there's the ethical dilemma of truth versus loyalty. And you have to transcend that. And in Shamil's program, Shamil Fatakov is a Russian producer of Happy Hippo programs, and in his program, he looks at truth versus loyalty and transcends the dilemma of what that means. So that's a really important point, that no attributes of God can ever be in conflict with one another. They aren't. They can't. And if they are, we haven't raised it to a high enough level. We're looking at the application in a too specific way. So, I want to give you an idea, though, of principles from other sources when we talk about that. The book Getting to Yes talks about principled negotiation. The 4 principles they say are needed in any resolution are asking, is it wise, is it objective, is it efficient, and will it build a relationship? The 4 principles for Rotarians in any decision: is it the truth? Is it fair? Will it build goodwill? And is it beneficial to all concerned? Those are excellent principles. The principles are what you look at before you take the action. Okay? And Rotarians say, well, if it doesn't do all 4 of these, then should I be doing this? Transformative mediation, one form of mediation says the decision should result in people not just being better off, but being better. Okay? So those are another way to look at principles. But we have so many principles and virtues in the faith that we're given that we don't. But I just wanted to show that principles are a common criteria used in decision making. And criteria is what you use to evaluate the choices you have in making decisions. So, we've just taken a look at what is the most important principles to apply and why are they important. The only reason I do this, I think you could probably find almost any virtue and any principle in any decision. They're not limited to just one. You can find aspects of unity and diversity, of trustworthiness and moral leadership. Maybe not equality of the genders. Maybe you can't always find that. Independent investigation of truth. You can find aspects of all of those. And certainly you can find virtues in everything. Love, respect, compassion, forbearance, steadfastness, humility, all of those types of things too. All I'm saying is here is just at least consider it. And if you have a choice between actions, take a look at which actions most clearly express the principles. Because ultimately, if we're teaching the faith, we're teaching the principles of the faith. We're teaching that through our actions, and our actions should be guided by principles. Okay? So this is how I use principles. And I mentioned before, one way I do it is in the choice model of ethics. Have anybody been to ethics types of trainings? Okay. Many ethical models teach yes and no, right? You're going along in points and yes, no. And they say that you don't have an ethical dilemma until you reach 2 yeses, right? Because yes, no's are easy. So you have a choice of 2 yeses. I don't teach a yes or no model of ethics. I think that's too limited. I teach a choice-based model of ethics, where you look at all of the choices you have, and you look at the principles you believe in, and which of these choices reflect your principles in the best way. Okay? Rather than, because the choice model just limits you to one choice, and it's yes or no. And the ethical, the traditional ethical model limits you to one choice. I say, let's look at all the choices you have, and look at the things you believe in. And I'll show you more about that, actually, after the break. We have a chance to go through that. Now, this is, by its nature, pretty darn nebulous, ephemeral, and all of those types of words. It's pretty fuzzy. What is this? What are we really doing here? How do we go about doing this? But it's a vital discussion to have, and especially, again, you don't need to do each one of these steps every time, but if you have a difficult decision, go back to the virtues and principles and use that to guide you. If you have nothing else, if you're not sure what action to take, and it's a very difficult thing to do. Use the virtues and principles to guide you, because you have something you founded it on. You say, well, we believe in unity and unity and diversity. I feel this is the one that most closely aligns with that, and allows you to take those actions. So, question?
Could it be said that this is actually developing a discipline to be aware of your purity of motive?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I guess you could say this is purity of motive, because the purity referring to the virtues and the motive referring to the action. Yeah, if you think about it in those terms. Okay. So think about this over lunch. Think about the questions you have related to this, because I want to kind of continue with that. This is a concept that is not typically found in ethical training. I've given trainings for public officials, statewide public officials, and I teach them this model, and they always go, what? You mean we have to choose what's the right thing to do? Ethics typically teaches you, ethics, and this is really interesting. If you think of a spectrum, and on the bottom is what's wrong, and on the top is what's right, and you have this kind of vertical line, right? So we know what's wrong. I mean, obviously we know murder, burglary, theft, assault. We know what's wrong, but somewhere on this line, somewhere on the spectrum, we draw a line, and anything below that line is a law. You can be punished for doing that. What's above the line is ethics. There's no law requiring you to do the right thing, to do a good thing. You only get punished for doing the wrong thing. Which brings up, we were having an interesting discussion on Baha'i justice in the future and the relationship between the guidance we're given for doing the right thing as laws. I mean, we have laws in the faith, around having an occupation, celebrating Holy Day. That's a law, but you don't have to celebrate with the group. You need to remember it in some way. But what will Baha'i laws mean in the future? The ones that we break those down into prohibitions, things you can't do, and kind of aspirations, things you should do. Okay, and then there's in the middle what's encouraged and what's discouraged along the spectrum. So what's happening in society now, if you stop and think about it, this line that we defined between right and wrong has been slowly creeping up. And as a result, there is less trust in society, because trust is built on risk. And with more laws, we lower the levels of risk people are taking. So people don't have to do the right thing. They're required to do the right thing. If you think in terms of the financial crisis, you don't need to have legislation for people to do all those things. And yet we come out with all the legislation now, and none of it will have any effect. Right? Because people will find other ways around that, of violating that. But if we keep passing laws, we'll never develop the ethical qualities we need as a society. I don't want to sound too libertarian here, but it's a relationship in society. Laws are needed. What level of law do we want, and how much should we be guided by ethics? And we're really talking, in what we're doing here, we're working on the top half of that. We're not at all developing punishments for what's illegal. We're working on the ethics of what we want to do, what we want to aspire to. But it's all part of that spectrum. Okay? So that's a little bit about ethics. I had a book I wrote actually based on Shamil's model of the work he was doing in Russia with the Happy Hippo program that talks about how, talks about an ethical decision really being based on three things. We talked about what's the truth, what are the principles, and what are the choices. If you want an ethical decision model, think of those three steps. And we've got truth in step 3. We've got choices in expand in step 5. And in step 7, we've got evaluate those choices. Or I'm sorry, we've got truth, We've got principles in step 6 and choices in step 7, evaluating those choices in step 7. But if you think about those 3 steps for ethical decision making, what's the truth? What are the principles? What are my choices?